welcome to my channel. If you are new here, my name is Samantha Leighanne, and I talk about books. Today we're doing a tag. I don't do a ton of tags, but as I kind of, like get back in the groove of things, I figured that doing a tag would be kind of a fun way to get back into things. Also, this is the horror Booktube Tag, which was originally created by Hey Little Thrifter. If you haven't watched her, linked in the down bar below, I highly recommend check her out, especially if you're into horror, which I'm gonna be honest, if you're watching me because you like horror, then chances are you've seen her. So, especially since I've been gone for so long. But, okay, so again, this is the horror Booktube Tag. It has 12 questions. So let's just jump right into it. So the first question is, how and when did you first get into horror? And I have been into horror for quite some time. My first memories of reading horror would of course be the scary stories to tell in the dark that I read as a kid. I feel like that's an experience that a lot of people my age and younger, kind of grew up with. That was my first experience with horror, but I think that I really became a fan of the genre in general. I was about 13 years old when I read my first Stephen King. I was in 7th grade, I believe, and it was Pet Sematary. I've told this story before, so if you're, if you've been here a while, sorry, this is the story that you're hearing again. I think that at that point was really when I began to enjoy the genre, and as I've gotten older and, kind of dived back into that, I find that I love it even more now, and I get a lot more things out of it. I actually did a whole discussion video on why I read horror, so I'll go ahead and link that in the card description up above if you would like to watch that. So, I kind of go a little bit more in depth. So there's that. And number 2 is the first horror book you read, which I actually just answered. So scary stories to tell in the dark, but secondary was Pet Sematary, Stephen King. Number 3 is, so what horror related goodness can we expect from your channel? I do talk about horror pretty frequently. I have a couple of recommendation videos, so I mentioned the discussion video already. I do have a horror books for beginners, and at the end of the year I talk about my favorite horror books. I can also link that video up above, best horror from 2018. If you're interested in watching that. But I also do a series on my channel called The King Chronicles. I'm currently reading Stephen King's books in chronological order, and with each book I do post a kind of review and discussion where I really kind of deep dive into each book. So obviously Stephen King doesn't just write horror, so it's not always going to be horror related, but that is just one of the things that I do. There's a playlist. It's another thing I can link up above if that's something that you haven't seen and you find yourself interested in it. So number 4, what are your favorite themes and subgenres in horror? Psychological horror for sure is something that I really love, and haunted house stories are another one of my favorites. Love haunted house stories, but I think psychological horror is for sure probably my absolute favorite subgenre. I also quite enjoy like demon and possession stories, 2 of which I can think of off the top of my head. A Head Full of Ghosts by Paul Tremblay was one of the best horror books that I read last year, and My Best Friend's Exorcism by Grady Hendrix I also really loved. So, and then of course when we talk about haunted house stories, obviously Haunting of Hill House, Shirley Jackson, an absolute classic. And another one that's coming up off the top of my head is Kill Creek by Scott Thomas. I thought that was very well done. A lot of influence from Haunting of Hill House as well. But I think that that book overall was really well written, and I really enjoyed it. And I'm looking forward to, I think he's got a book coming out at the end of this year or beginning of next year. I can't remember when, but I'm really excited about that. So number 5, an underrated horror novel or author. I don't really feel like I'm qualified to talk about anything underrated, because I feel like a lot of the things that I talk about are, a lot of the books and stuff that I talk about are like a little bit more mainstream in terms of the genre. So I don't think that I can think of anything that's like super underrated. I'm gonna take this opportunity to not talk about a underrated horror author, but one that is indie published, and so I feel like not as many people know about her. Christy DeMeester, who has written a short story collection called Everything That's Underneath, and a full-length novel called Beneath. I have read both of those. Actually, Beneath is the book that got me out of my reading slump while I was on vacation. I read that at the beginning of June and loved it. Very well done. She has a style of writing that's extremely atmospheric, and it gave me such creepy vibes. I think that she's a really amazing writer, and if you're looking, especially female written horror, which is something that we don't see a ton of in the mainstream, if that's something that you're interested in, I highly recommend checking her out because she's great. And then talking about an overrated horror author. You know what? I'm gonna be controversial. I'm gonna be controversial for a second, and I'm gonna say that Stephen King is an overrated horror author. Don't break out the pitchforks. You guys know that I have a love of Stephen King, but when we talk about strictly horror authors, he is not. But unfortunately, he is one of those people that is synonymous with horror. And there are reasons for that. He has written some really excellent horror books. You know, when we talk about psychological horror like The Shining or Vampires, Salem's Lot, he has written some amazing horror books. However, he also writes a lot more than horror. And so I feel like he is always talked about as being like the be all end all of horror authors, and he's just not. So that's how I feel about that. Next question, 3 favorite horror novels. The Ruins by Scott Smith. Love that book. Talk about that book all the time. I actually want to reread it. Like, I really want to reread it. I'm gonna go not Stephen King or Joe Hill. That's what we're gonna do. So now I need to consult my bookshelves for a minute. I think another one would probably actually be My Best Friend's Exorcism by Grady Hendrix. And I would say Haunting of Hill House by Shirley Jackson. I think that that's probably the third. I feel like that book is just so well done, and it has influenced so much modern horror, you know, that it's just, I love it. So recommend a book to someone who is new to the genre. I actually have a whole video, Horror for Beginners, which I already linked, but that is a thing that exists in the world. A couple of books off the top of my head that I can think of. I think that Horror Store by Grady Hendrix is a really good place to start. It's fun, it's quirky, but there are some horrific moments. So if you're not super into the genre or you are a big baby, I think that that's a big baby. I think that that's just like a fun book to read. Yeah, I think that if I was gonna pick one book to tell somebody to read, if they're new to the horror genre, I would pick that one for sure. Horror book to film adaptations that you loved or hated. So I'm also going to be controversial because I've actually seen both sides of this, people that loved it and people that hated it. Haunting of Hill House, the Netflix series that was adapted, I thought that was brilliant, okay? I loved it, and it ended up being so much more than horror, which I personally feel like the book itself is so much more than horror. There's a lot more to it. There's a lot more layers, and I just thought that even though they did change the core of the story and made it more about a family unit, it was just so beautifully done, and it kept a lot of the central themes, you know, that appeared in the original book and molded a lot of those things to fit the story of this family that appears in the Netflix series. And that was just so brilliantly done. You can argue with me if you want to, but I don't care. So don't argue with me, actually. You're perfectly entitled to your opinion, but I loved that series. I was not expecting to feel the way that I did about it. There were several points in that series, especially at the end, where like I had such an emotional reaction that I was not expecting to have. So it crosses the line from that horror, you know, drama, like deep emotional. It was just so fucking good. It really was. It was just so fucking good. My other adaptations that I really love, obviously go classic, Stanley Kubrick's The Shining, which we all know that King himself hates, but I thought as a film, it was excellently done. When you look at it as an adaptation of the book, it's not exactly faithful. I feel like they are both excellent in their own right, but if we're just strictly talking about, you know, things based off of other things, I guess, I do very much enjoy that. The horror film Hellraiser, which was based off of the novella The Hellbound Heart by Clive Barker. Love that franchise, even though once you get past like the second one, it devolves into garbage. But the original film and the novella I love. And that's all I can think of for adaptations right now. Yeah, that's all I can think of for adaptations off the top of my head. I'm doing this very off the cuff. Usually I like actually plan out answers, and I didn't this time. So we're winging it. How do you discover new horror books? The same way that everybody else does, Twitter and Instagram and Booktube. I say everybody else, but people a part of this community. That's pretty much how I find my recommendations. I find them on Twitter a lot. There's a couple different accounts that I follow. Also the podcast Books in the Freezer, which is hosted by Rachel from Shades of Orange and Stephanie from That's What She Read. I love them both dearly. They are both amazing and their podcast is amazing. So I'll also link that down below. If for some reason you live under a rock and you haven't started not watching, and you don't listen to that, you can get some really great recommendations, and the ladies themselves are just awesome. So definitely check them out. But in addition to that, like just following them on Twitter and a couple different other accounts that I follow as well, you know, give me a lot of recommendations. Also, I find that following like horror authors, you also see a lot about books that I wouldn't have otherwise heard of. So like for example, Keelan Patrick Burke, I follow him on Twitter and Instagram as well. And he has put some recommendations out there that I had never heard of. So I appreciate that. What was the last horror book you bought? That's a good question because I haven't bought books in a really long time because moving. The last horror book that I bought was The Rest Maidens by Gwendolyn Kist. I bought it on my Kindle and I'm about halfway through it right now. Actually, now that I'm thinking about it, yeah, I'm about halfway through it. I'm enjoying it. Not done yet, so I'm not gonna speak anything other than that, but that's the last horror book that I bought. And I bought that actually directly after I finished Beneath by Christy DeMeester. I wanted another female written horror book, so. And a horror book at the top of your wish list. The only thing that's coming to mind right now off the top of my head is Growing Things, I think is what it's called, by Paul Tremblay. I've read several of his books in the last year and absolutely loved them. So like Head Full of Ghosts, I absolutely loved. And then what was the other one? Cabin at the End of the World. I liked that one. I didn't love it, but this is a short story collection if I'm not mistaken, and y'all know I love short fiction, so I really want to get my hands on that one. And then the last question is asking about tags, but I've been absent for so long and I don't know who's done this and who hasn't, so I'm not going to tag anyone, but if you want to do this, feel free. So that's all I have for you guys for this tag. Thank you to Jade for tagging me. I love that you thought of me for this, and I love that I am somebody that people associate with horror, so that's a win in my book, staying on brand. But anyways, yes, that is all I have for you guys for this tag. As always, if you like what you see and you want to see more, make sure you click thumbs up and hit subscribe if you haven't already. All of my social media links can be found in the down bar below. You can contact me on Goodreads, Twitter, and Instagram. Thank you guys so very much for watching, and I will see you all next time. Bye.